A flight attendant swung an emergency hammer at a colonel during boarding. Seconds later, that same tool snapped his wrist, and what happened next will leave you speechless. He raised an emergency hammer against a child, blind to the father's pleas. Subscribe if you believe no revenge should ever target the innocent. The hammer came down before anyone had time to react. The sharp metallic glint of the emergency tool cut through the dim cabin light as it swung in a deadly arc, striking the side of Aaron Valen's head with a dull, sickening crack that seemed to echo off every surface of the aircraft. The boy's sketchbook slid from his lap, fluttering to the floor like a wounded bird as a splash of red appeared at his temple. Passengers gasped and froze, their shocked cries caught in their throats. For a heartbeat, the cabin was silent except for the thrum of the engines, a sound suddenly alien and menacing. Colonel Marcus Valen, seated beside his son, lurched to his feet so violently that his seatbelt snapped against his thigh. His instincts screamed to act, but the sight of Aaron clutching his head, blood slipping between his fingers, made his chest constrict. "Aaron!" he shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and fury. He reached for his son, pulling him close, his uniform instantly stained with dark red. The world narrowed to the sound of his boy's ragged breathing and the towering shadow of the man who had struck him. Silas Braun stood over them, hammer still raised, his knuckles white around the bright orange handle. His eyes were hard and unblinking, the expression of someone who had crossed a point of no return. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, but no one moved to intervene. Silas's presence radiated something raw and dangerous, anger honed into a weapon. He lowered the hammer slightly but didn't release it, the muscles in his jaw twitching as he spoke. "Your father cost me everything," he hissed, the words a blade sharpened over years of resentment. His voice was low but carried through the cabin like a cold wind. Marcus's breath came fast and shallow. His mind reeled, yet his training tried to impose order on chaos. He forced his voice to steady, holding up a hand between Silas and his son. "Silas, put the hammer down. You're making a mistake," he said, his tone firm but pleading. His eyes flicked to the hammer, to Silas's stance, to the passengers whose wide eyes reflected panic and confusion. He couldn't escalate, not with civilians trapped in a metal tube at 30,000 feet, but his body tensed, ready to spring if Silas moved again. Aaron whimpered softly, pressing closer to his father. The sound cut through Marcus like shrapnel. He wanted to shield the boy completely, to place himself between him and the hammer, but he knew one wrong move could push Silas further. "Please," Marcus said, his voice rough, "don't hurt him. This is between you and me." His fingers trembled as they clutched Aaron's shoulder, feeling the boy's pulse fluttering like a frightened bird beneath his palm. Silas's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You don't get to decide that anymore," he muttered. He glanced at the passengers as if daring them to intervene. None did. A man near the back pressed himself against the window. A mother clutched her child tighter. The cabin seemed to shrink, the air thick with tension. Silas shifted the hammer to his other hand, flexing his fingers as though savoring the moment. Marcus's thoughts raced. He remembered Silas from years ago, reckless and ambitious, always pushing the limits. He had disciplined him then to save lives. Had that moment planted the seed for this? He saw in Silas's eyes not just hatred but purpose. This wasn't a random outburst, it was planned. The realization chilled him. He tried to appeal again, his voice low, controlled. "Silas, listen to me. You're not thinking clearly. Put it down before you do something you can't take back." For a moment, the cabin hummed with the possibility that words might work. But then Silas leaned closer, his face inches from Marcus's, his breath hot with rage. "I've been thinking clearly for years," he whispered. "Every night I've pictured this. You, powerless." Watching, his eyes flicked down to Aaron, who stared back weakly, his lips moving as if to speak, but no sound coming out. Marcus's heart pounded. He shifted his stance, subtly positioning himself between Silas and Aaron. Passengers whispered, some fumbling with phones, others frozen. The engine's steady drone seemed louder now, the fluorescent lights above flickering slightly as if the plane itself sensed the tension. Silas lowered the hammer just enough to let a single droplet of blood fall from its edge onto the carpeted aisle. The crimson bead spread into the fibers like ink. His voice cut through the murmur of the cabin. "Do you feel it now, Marcus?" The fear? His smile widened, but his eyes stayed cold. Marcus swallowed hard, his mind running through every possible move. His training told him to strike fast, disarm, neutralize, but Aaron's limp form against his side held him back. If Silas swung again, he might not miss. Marcus tried once more, his voice rising with desperation. "Stop this now. Take me instead. Don't touch him." The hammer twitched in Silas's grip, his arm trembling slightly as though fighting some inner command. But then he straightened, his voice low and final. "No," he said, almost softly. "This isn't about you dying. This is about you watching." His eyes locked on Marcus's, unblinking, filled with something dark and resolute. Marcus's hands tightened on Aaron's shoulders, his nails digging into his own palms. He knew a storm had broken loose that he could not contain with words alone. The passengers seemed to collectively hold their breath, the cabin suspended in a moment between terror and action. Silas raised the hammer again slightly, not to strike but to show control, letting the cabin see who held power now. Marcus's lips parted, but no sound came. He could feel every beat of his heart, every breath of his son, every whisper of the passengers around them. He didn't know how this would end, only that the next moments would shape everything. Silas leaned in one last time, his voice a dark promise that seemed to hang in the recycled air of the plane. "The reckoning begins tonight." Chaos erupted instantly inside the aircraft, the cabin's hum of engines swallowed by a wave of screams and frantic movement. Seats rattled as passengers jolted upright, some clawing for the aisle, others clutching armrests as though the thin fabric could shield them. A young man bolted toward the rear, knocking over a service cart. Another passenger shouted hoarsely for help, his voice cracking under panic. The narrow space filled with the sharp smell of fear, sweat, metal, and the faint tang of blood. Colonel Marcus Valen dropped to his knees, gathering Aaron into his arms with trembling hands. Warm blood seeped into his uniform, streaking the metals on his chest. Aaron's sketchbook lay on the floor, pages smeared red where it had landed. "Stay with me, son," Marcus whispered urgently, his voice a tight knot of command and desperation. He pressed his palm to the boy's temple, trying to stem the bleeding, eyes flicking up to the man who had caused it. Silas Braun stood a few steps away, the emergency hammer raised loosely in his grip. His face glistened under the cabin lights, a sheen of sweat mixed with fury. The lines of his jaw were taut, his eyes locked on Marcus like a predator savoring its advantage. He took a deliberate step back, planting his feet wide as if daring the colonel to cross the narrow aisle. "Move closer," Silas said, his tone a low growl vibrating with old hatred. "I want you to." Marcus's training screamed for action, but the presence of terrified civilians anchored him. One rash movement could send the man lashing out again, and Aaron, his boy, was already wounded. Marcus steadied his breathing, forcing his hands to stay on the injury rather than reach for a weapon he did not have. "Silas, listen to me," he said, his voice low but cutting through the noise. "This isn't you. Put the hammer down." Silas's lips curled into a humorless smile. "Not me. You don't get to tell me who I am." His eyes flicked toward the passengers, scanning their pale faces. "Tell them, Colonel. Tell them how you destroyed my career, how you wrote those reports, signed those papers, and left me to rot while you climbed higher." He spoke louder now, projecting to the cabin like a man addressing a jury. "He cost me everything." The passengers looked between the two men, some shrinking further into their seats, others trembling in confusion. Marcus's voice tightened but remained calm. "You were reckless, Silas. You endangered lives. The record speaks for itself." He spoke deliberately, hoping to pierce the fog of rage, but Silas only laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and alien in the cramped space. Aaron stirred weakly in his father's arms. "Dad." His voice was faint, a child's plea drawn thin by pain. His eyelids fluttered. "Don't." That single word cut through Marcus like a blade. His body tensed, muscles coiling with instinct. In one swift movement he started to rise, cradling Aaron with one arm, his other hand reaching out toward Silas. But the hammer moved first. Silas swung not at Aaron but at the cabin wall, inches from Marcus's face. The bright orange tool smashed into the panel with a violent crack, denting the thin metal and shattering the overhead light above them. A burst of sparks rained down, flickering like fireflies before snuffing out. Gasps and cries erupted from the passengers, the cabin now lit by a broken, uneven glow. The sudden jolt of noise made Aaron flinch in his father's grasp. Marcus froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. Silas's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. It was a warning, a demonstration of power carefully measured to stop just short of another direct blow. "You think you're in control?" Silas hissed, his knuckles white around the handle. Marcus's mind sharpened under pressure. His soldier's instincts cataloged everything. Silas's stance, the angle of the hammer, the distance to the nearest passenger. And then he saw it. A small but crucial detail. The hammer's handle had splintered from the impact, a hairline crack snaking through the plastic grip. It wasn't much, but it was something. A weakness. He filed it away like a battlefield observation. Strategy in motion, even in chaos. His eyes flicked to the passengers, noting their terror but also their potential. Some were rising now, hesitant but no longer frozen. If he could buy time, if he could draw Silas's attention, maybe they could help Aaron. But the weight of the moment pressed down like gravity. His son's blood on his hands, his enemy standing over them. No rescue in sight. Marcus's jaw clenched, his breath steady but shallow. He could feel the shift in the cabin, the passengers watching, waiting, sensing that something far larger than a mid-air dispute was unfolding. Silas leaned closer, his shadow falling across Marcus and Aaron like a dark veil. His voice dropped to a hiss that carried the venom of years. "You'll break long before I do," Silas hissed. The intercom crackled overhead. "This is the captain. Silas Braun, stand down immediately or we will be forced to initiate an emergency landing." The announcement barely ended before Silas let out a growl of fury and slammed the emergency hammer into the handset by the wall. Sparks erupted as plastic shattered and the device snapped off in a limp, useless arc. The sound echoed through the stunned silence of the cabin, louder than it should have been. Every eye turned toward him, every breath seemed to stop. Marcus remained frozen in place, hands raised slightly as if holding back an invisible tide. Across the aisle, passengers flinched, mothers wrapped arms around their children, and elderly men clutched the backs of seats like lifelines. Aaron lay limp against the armrest, blood still streaking down from his temple, his breaths shallow but alive, and yet no one moved. No one dared challenge the man holding a weapon. Silas turned slowly, his face twisted in contempt and triumph. "They won't open the cockpit door," he said, voice sharp and steady. "They know what happens if they do." He reached into the inner lining of his jacket, his fingers methodical and deliberate. From within, he pulled a jagged piece of metal, sharpened at one end and wrapped in black cloth for grip. The blade gleamed under the cabin lights, its edge uneven but wickedly pointed. Murmurs rippled through the passengers. Some ducked lower in their seats. A baby whimpered somewhere near the back. Silas held the blade and hammer like a judge ready to deliver sentence. "This plane is my courtroom now," he declared, sweeping his gaze across the terrified faces. "And the man you all admire, the hero, the colonel, is nothing but a coward in uniform." Marcus clenched his fists, ignoring the pulse in his wounded arm. His military instincts urged him to act. But Aaron lay so close, too vulnerable. A wrong move would cost him everything. "What do you want?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice low and calm. Silas's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, inches from Marcus's face. "I want you to say it," he said coldly. "Right here, in front of all these people. Admit that you ruined me. Admit you destroyed a man better than you out of pride and jealousy. I want to hear it from your lips." Marcus stood firm. "You were reckless," he replied evenly. "You endangered lives." "I did what any officer would have done." "That's not an admission," Silas snapped, his jaw tightening. "No," Marcus said, "and you won't get one." A quiet cough from Aaron interrupted the moment. The boy shifted, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "Dad, don't." The two men froze. Marcus's heart twisted at the sound, but Silas's face twisted with rage. He turned abruptly, raising the hammer high above Aaron's head. The motion was fast. Too fast. Marcus reacted on instinct. He grabbed the nearest object in reach, a food tray still buckled into the seat back. He tore it free and swung it upward with all his strength. The hammer collided with the tray with a deafening clang. The vibration shot up Silas's arm, making him stumble. The weapon slipped from his hand and skidded down the aisle, clattering under the seats like a bone tossed in a pit. The cabin erupted in gasps. Passengers jerked upright, some leaning into the aisle to see where the hammer had gone. A flicker of hope sparked in their eyes, brief, tentative. But Silas was faster than anyone expected. With a howl, he turned and slashed the blade at Marcus, the jagged metal slicing across the colonel's forearm. Hot pain exploded in Marcus's nerves. He staggered, clutching the wound, blood seeping between his fingers. But he didn't fall. His eyes stayed locked on the fallen hammer, now just 2 rows away. Every nerve in his body screamed in pain, but his mind focused like steel. The weapon that had shattered his son's peace was now loose, within reach, and Marcus would be the one to claim it. Passengers around him dared not speak, but their eyes followed the colonel. The cabin wasn't safe, not yet. The danger hadn't passed. The man with the blade was still standing. But something had shifted. In that moment, the power had changed hands. Marcus gritted his teeth, pushing the pain down, stepping forward even as blood dripped from his arm and stained the floor. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He only moved. Because now, the hammer no longer belonged to Silas. It was a symbol of something else entirely. The tide had shifted, but at what cost? Blood poured freely from Colonel Marcus Valen's upper arm, staining the sleeve of his uniform in dark, pulsing waves. He didn't notice. Pain had become background noise. The only thing that mattered now was the weapon sliding across the floor, the cracked emergency hammer that moments ago had nearly crushed his son's skull. Silas lunged with wild eyes, his breath ragged, blade glinting in one hand as he hurled his weight forward with nothing but venom and madness. But Marcus moved first. He pivoted sharply, his boots grinding against the slick aisle, dodging the attack with soldier's precision. He didn't need to think. Instinct took over. Years of field training surged through his nerves, dulling the pain and sharpening his focus. Their shoulders collided with a thud, the force of 2 men driven by entirely different reasons, one by obsession, the other by the need to protect. The hammer clattered under the seats, spinning just out of reach like a cruel joke. Both men hit the ground in a tangle of limbs. Grunting with effort, Marcus shoved himself forward on his elbows, crawling beneath the row of passenger seats. He saw it, just inches away, wedged under a shoe someone had abandoned in panic. Behind him, Silas cursed, scrambling after him, blade scraping along the aisle floor. "I'll finish your boy before your eyes," Silas hissed, breath hot and foul near Marcus's ear. That sentence did something irreparable. A red haze fell over Marcus's vision. The thought of Aaron, bleeding, broken, alone, flashed like lightning behind his eyes. With a roar that came from someplace deeper than rage, he twisted around and delivered a solid kick to Silas's chest. The flight attendant stumbled backward into a passenger seat, his blade slicing the edge of the cushion and ripping it open with a sharp tear. Gasps erupted throughout the cabin. The chaos had shifted from horror to full-blown warfare. Passengers huddled against the walls, eyes wide, some praying, some weeping, others frozen with disbelief. Every seat had become a bunker, every aisle a battlefield. Marcus reached again. This time his fingers closed around the hammer. The handle was warm, splintered where it had cracked against the cabin wall earlier, but it felt like resolution in his grip. He rose in a single, fluid motion. The overhead lights flickered above him, casting sharp shadows across the terrified faces. Silas charged, blade raised. But Marcus was ready. He stepped aside, letting the swing pass harmlessly, and then brought the hammer down, not at Silas's head, though instinct cried for vengeance, but at the wrist that held the weapon. There was a crack, loud, unmistakable, final. Silas screamed. The blade flew from his hand, clattering to the floor and spinning into the corner of the galley. His arm bent unnaturally, wrist shattered clean through. He collapsed to the ground, writhing in agony, cradling his limp hand against his chest. The passengers, too afraid to cheer but too relieved to stay silent, let out a collective exhale. Some broke from their seats, rushing toward Aaron. One man in a denim jacket knelt beside the boy, pressing napkins to the wound on his temple. Another reached for a phone, attempting to call the cockpit. But Marcus wasn't listening anymore. His gaze was locked on Silas, the man who had turned an aircraft into a battleground, who had nearly stolen the most precious thing in his life. And now, that man lay crumpled and groaning beneath him, broken not by a bullet, not by a court, but by the very tool he had used to spill innocent blood. Marcus's hands trembled, not with fear, but restraint. He could end it now. He could silence Silas for good, but he didn't raise the hammer again. Not yet. Not like this. He stood tall in the aisle, blood dripping from his arm, eyes steeled with something colder than revenge. Justice. Passengers watched in stunned silence. Some nodded in respect, others wiped tears from their cheeks. In that moment, the colonel was no longer just a man defending his son. He was a figure of resilience, of control in the face of chaos. Behind him, Aaron let out a soft, rasping breath, stirring for the first time since the attack. Marcus turned, lowering the hammer, heart surging at the faint sign of life. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He simply stood his ground, the hammer resting at his side, his enemy broken before him, his son still breathing. The battle might not be over, but the tide had turned. Justice sometimes comes from the very tool meant to destroy you. Silas, crippled but not defeated, spat blood onto the cabin floor, his face contorted with pain and fury. His broken wrist hung limply, swelling fast beneath his torn sleeve, yet the hatred in his eyes burned hotter than ever. He crouched low against the wall of the aircraft, teeth clenched, breathing ragged through the fire of his injury. Across from him, Colonel Marcus Valen stood tall, the emergency hammer gripped tight in his hand, not raised in vengeance but held steady like a sentinel's weapon. His chest rose and fell with the weight of what had just happened. His arm ached from the earlier blade wound, and his uniform was stained with both his and Aaron's blood. But Marcus's grip did not tremble. Not anymore. "You think this ends with me?" Silas rasped, voice thick with venom. The edges of his mouth curled into a grin despite the agony twisting his wrist. "You think this is about me? About one man with a grudge?" Marcus said nothing. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning every inch of Silas's movements, watching for any last surge of violence. But he didn't lift the hammer. He didn't step forward. His training pulled him back from the edge. Silas wasn't a threat anymore, not in the way he had been moments ago, but the danger wasn't gone. It had only changed shape. Passengers began to stir. The paralysis that had gripped the cabin started to loosen. The man, seated directly behind Aaron, moved first, leaning over with shaking hands to press a bundle of napkins against the boy's temple. Aaron was conscious, but just barely, his breathing shallow, his eyes fluttering open and shut like a light struggling to stay lit. Marcus knelt beside him, one hand still on the hammer, the other brushing his son's cheek gently. "I'm here," Marcus whispered, his voice steady despite the war thundering inside him. "You're going to be okay. Just stay with me." Aaron gave a faint nod, the smallest sign of life, but enough to fuel Marcus's resolve. Behind them, another male passenger fumbled with a phone, trying to reach the cockpit or emergency services through a backup communication line. The cabin lights flickered, casting sharp shadows across the faces of frightened men now peeking above seats, their gazes darting between the colonel and the bloodied flight attendant who had become a nightmare midair. Silas didn't stay quiet for long. "You're wasting your breath," he called out, louder now, the pain in his wrist sharpening his voice into something nearly feral. "He can't protect you. You think a medal and a uniform make him a savior? You should all know what kind of man Marcus Valen really is." Marcus didn't rise to the bait. He kept his focus on Aaron, but the words dug deep. Not because he believed them, but because Silas knew exactly where to aim. Words could plant seeds of doubt faster than weapons. "You ruined men better than you'll ever be," Silas continued, inching himself into a sitting position against the bulkhead. "You think you stopped something today? There are others. They watched what you did to us, how you climbed over bodies for medals. They're waiting." Marcus turned his head, just enough to lock eyes with him. The look in the colonel's gaze wasn't rage anymore. It was calculation, strategy, restraint mixed with clarity. He didn't speak, but the silence was heavier than a bullet. Around them, the tension in the cabin shifted again. No longer just fear, now a creeping uncertainty. The enemy had spoken, and though defeated, he had left a trail of questions in his wake. Was this personal, or was it political? Were there more like him? Silas's voice dropped to a hiss, meant for Marcus alone. "They'll gut your legacy from the inside." "I'm just the opening act." Marcus rose to his full height. He took a step forward, placing himself fully between Silas and Aaron. The hammer hung at his side, blood and scratches still streaked across its cracked handle. He looked at Silas for a long moment, then spoke in a voice low and firm. "You're done," Marcus said, "but if there's anyone else hiding behind you, they'll have to come through me." "And I won't be standing alone." Silas barked a laugh, a dry rattle of contempt. "You don't even know who you're fighting yet." Marcus didn't reply. Instead, he turned to Aaron, crouching again as his son stirred. The boy's hand found his father's and squeezed weakly. For a moment, all the noise, the cabin hum, the whispered panic, The poisoned words faded. All that remained was the sound of Marcus's promise. "You're safe now," he murmured, brushing a hand over Aaron's forehead. "I won't let anyone touch you again." The hammer, once a symbol of terror, now gleamed under the cabin light, not as a weapon, but as a vow. Silas sagged against the wall, pain dulling his features, but that hateful smirk never quite left. Even as passengers moved to restrain him again with belts and blankets, his words lingered in the air like smoke after a blaze. The battle inside the cabin was over, but Marcus could feel it, thrumming just beneath the surface of his pulse. This was only the beginning. Every scar carried a shadow, and his son's blood was only the opening mark. The plane jolted sharply as it began its descent, the sudden tilt pressing passengers back into their seats. Oxygen masks didn't drop, but fear clung to the air like smoke. The captain's voice broke through the intercom, brittle and uneven. "We are making an emergency landing at a nearby military-controlled airfield. Please remain seated and calm." The words were meant to reassure, but they only deepened the panic. Colonel Marcus Valen barely registered the announcement. His hands trembled as he held his jacket tight against his son's bleeding head. Aaron's skin was pale, lips parted, breath shallow. His eyes fluttered open, then closed again, lost in a haze of pain and exhaustion. "Stay with me," Marcus whispered, brushing a shaking hand through his son's hair. "You're going to be all right. Just hang on." Across the aisle, restrained in a seat by two passengers, Silas Braun sat rigid, his arm cradled against his chest. The wrist had swelled grotesquely, twisted at an unnatural angle, but the pain didn't seem to matter to him. His eyes never left Marcus, not in fear, not in regret, but in triumph. His mouth curled into a sick smirk, and then he spoke, voice low and menacing. "They'll hear my side before yours." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They slithered through the charged silence like venom. One of the passengers holding him flinched slightly, but Silas remained calm, calculating. Marcus said nothing in return, but the chill that crept into his spine was undeniable. He kept his eyes on Aaron, but his mind was now split, half in the moment, half racing ahead into danger he could no longer clearly define. The landing gear groaned beneath them, wheels straining against gravity as the aircraft neared the runway. Marcus instinctively tightened his grip on the armrest with one hand, the other still cradling Aaron. The screech of the tires hitting asphalt was followed by a jarring shudder that rocked the cabin. Some passengers screamed, others gasped, but all were silenced by what came next. Before the plane had even fully stopped, shadows moved outside the windows, uniformed figures sprinting toward the fuselage. The cabin lights flickered slightly, casting everything in cold, sterile brightness. Then the doors were thrown open, and the storm arrived. Federal officers poured in, guns raised, movements sharp and rehearsed. "Hands visible! Stay in your seats," one barked. A few passengers cried out in fear, ducking or shielding themselves, but no shots were fired. The officers spread quickly through the cabin, scanning for threats. It should have felt like relief. It didn't. Marcus stayed where he was, shielding Aaron's body with his own. He raised one hand slowly, showing he was not a threat. One officer moved toward him, but not to help. His weapon remained drawn, though lowered. Marcus looked up, ready to identify himself, but the words froze in his throat. He saw it, a fleeting, almost imperceptible motion. One of the officers, helmeted and stern, glanced at Silas. Their eyes met, and in that split second, the man gave a nod. Not a greeting, not a command. A signal. Marcus's stomach turned cold. It was subtle. Too subtle for the average passenger to notice, but not for a man who had led missions behind enemy lines. Not for a soldier who had survived betrayals and broken chains of command. It was the nod of an insider recognizing another, a gesture exchanged by men on the same side of a hidden war. Marcus didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply watched as Silas's expression shifted, just enough to reveal satisfaction. Not relief, not fear, satisfaction. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. Two of the federal officers approached Silas next. Marcus expected them to drag him down the aisle in cuffs, weapons drawn, but instead they helped him up, almost gently. One even braced his good shoulder while the other guided him toward the exit. There were no handcuffs, no barked orders, just quiet, careful handling, like he was something fragile and valuable. Marcus's jaw tightened. "Why isn't he restrained?" he asked sharply, addressing the officer still near him. "Stand down, Colonel," the man replied, cold and dismissive. "This is beyond you." The words landed like a punch to the chest. Beyond him. His son lay wounded, soaked in blood, attacked mid-flight, and this was beyond him? He stood slowly, ignoring the officer's stiff posture. His muscles burned with the effort, but his eyes locked on Silas as the man was escorted down the aisle. Their gazes met one last time, and Silas's smirk deepened. Marcus's fists clenched at his sides. This wasn't a clean extraction. This was a quiet transfer, a relocation, a cover. Passengers behind him began murmuring, grateful to be alive, thankful the nightmare seemed to be ending. But Marcus knew better. The true nightmare had just begun. There was something foul beneath the surface, something protected. As he sat again beside Aaron, the boy stirred, his fingers curling around his father's hand. Marcus leaned down, brushing his thumb across the boy's cheek. "You're safe now," he whispered, trying to make himself believe it. "I won't let anyone touch you again." But even as he spoke, his eyes trailed back toward the cockpit door, then the open exit where Silas had vanished. His grip on Aaron's hand tightened as the cold realization settled deep in his bones. The war was stepping off the plane with them. The hangar doors groaned shut behind the last of the passengers as the noise of the tarmac was sealed off by thick metal. Inside, the sterile air buzzed with tension. Floodlights cast sharp white beams across the concrete floor, highlighting the chaos now being transformed into protocol. Uniformed officers moved in rigid formations, barking orders and herding passengers toward makeshift processing stations. Ambulance medics waited near the far wall, and military technicians moved in quiet haste, tagging luggage and logging statements. Colonel Marcus Valen stood motionless amid the storm, his fists clenched, his sleeve soaked in blood, his son's blood. Aaron had already been taken away on a stretcher, his face pale, a medic shouting vitals as they disappeared into the corridor. Marcus's heart followed every step of that stretcher, but he remained rooted, waiting for someone to acknowledge what had happened. Instead, they approached Silas. Two officers moved toward the former flight attendant, now hunched over with his shattered wrist cradled against his chest. Marcus expected them to cuff him, restrain him, haul him into custody with the severity such an act demanded. But what he saw struck him cold. The officers didn't shove or drag Silas, they carried him, carefully, one on each side, guiding him with what could almost be mistaken for respect. Silas winced with each step, but his face wore a smirk, a smug, knowing curl of the lip that seemed more fitting on a man who had won. Marcus surged forward. "Restrain him properly," he barked, pointing a blood-stained finger. "He's assaulted a minor. He's endangered a flight. What in God's name are you doing?" One of the officers paused just long enough to meet his eyes and snap back, "Stand down, Colonel. This is beyond you." The words hit harder than any hammer. Marcus's body froze. His breath caught. He looked around, suddenly aware of how alone he was in that room full of uniforms. These were his people, military personnel, law enforcement, and yet their posture toward him was wary, not welcoming, controlled, coordinated. He opened his mouth to speak again, but found no words. Instead, he watched as Silas was escorted not to a holding cell, but to a private medical unit partitioned off with privacy curtains and guards at the corners. Marcus's jaw tightened. His hand instinctively found the pocket where the emergency hammer still lay wrapped in cloth. It felt heavier now, not just in weight, but in meaning. Minutes later, two plainclothesmen arrived. Neither wore insignias, but both moved like they belonged. Without introduction, they signaled to Marcus. "With us." He followed them down a long hallway flanked by concrete walls and security cameras. The doors ahead bore no labels, but when they opened, he was guided into a small, windowless interrogation room. The lights buzzed faintly overhead. A steel table and two chairs waited. They motioned for him to sit. He didn't. One of the men, tall with silver hair and a voice like ice, stepped forward. "Colonel Valen, we're not here to discuss your actions on the flight." Marcus frowned. "Then why am I here?" The other man, broader with a notebook he never opened, spoke. "We're interested in your last few operations, the ones classified under Tier 4 clearance, specifically your involvement with Operation Lancer and the procurement block you placed on the Arcadium weapons contract." Marcus's stomach dropped. Those files were restricted to only the highest level of oversight, far above a disgraced flight attendant or commercial incident. He didn't respond right away. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice low and measured. The taller man stepped closer, hands clasped behind his back. "Let's just say some decisions you've made have drawn scrutiny." "And Silas Braun?" Marcus pressed. "Was he sent to provoke me? Is this all connected?" Neither man answered. Instead, they exchanged a brief glance that told Marcus everything he needed to know. Silas wasn't a lone actor. He was a chess piece, and someone, somewhere, was playing a far larger game. The questioning dragged on. For hours, they danced around specifics, repeatedly circling back to his opposition of the Arcadium contract, his history of filing corruption complaints, and the growing number of junior officers who looked up to him. It wasn't an investigation. It was a probe. They weren't interested in what had happened on the plane. They were interested in weakening Marcus Valen. When the silver-haired man finally closed his file and stood, he offered nothing. "No charges will be filed at this time," he said with forced politeness. "You're free to return to the infirmary." Marcus stared at him, then asked the question he'd been holding back for hours. "My son. Where is he? Is he stable?" Silence. The broader man didn't even look up. Marcus stepped forward, fists clenched. "I asked you a direct question." The silver-haired man's face remained unreadable. "This briefing is concluded." "You're dismissed, Colonel." It took every ounce of discipline Marcus had to turn and walk out. The hallway felt longer this time. Every camera seemed to blink with suspicion. Every soldier he passed avoided his eyes. The silence had shifted. It wasn't just ignorance. It was complicity. As he stepped back into the fluorescent glare of the main hangar, Marcus's thoughts turned inward. He had entered the plane as a father and a soldier. He had exited it as a threat. The air felt colder now. The hammer weighed heavier in his coat. He didn't know who was behind it yet. But they had made a mistake. They had left him breathing. And somewhere behind those guarded curtains his son still waited for him. The hammer had shattered more than bone. It had struck the heart of a hidden war. He smashed the colonel's son's head while the father begged for mercy, using safety as a weapon for his own spite. If you believe every cruel act must be answered, hit subscribe now. Justice starts here. At dawn, the heavy steel doors of the holding corridor groaned open, and Colonel Marcus Valen stepped into the pale morning light. No charges, no apology, just silence and suspicion. His uniform was still stained with his son's blood, the dark red patches dried and stiff across the fabric. The officers who escorted him out said nothing, their eyes avoiding his, their posture guarded. Marcus didn't care. All that mattered was his son. He moved quickly across the tarmac, boots striking the ground in sharp, purposeful steps. The air was cold, biting against his skin, but his thoughts burned hotter than ever. Inside the temporary field infirmary, he found Aaron exactly where he had left him, on a narrow cot beneath white sheets, a saline drip in his arm, his face still marked with bruises but breathing. Alive. That was enough. For now. Aaron's eyes opened slowly as Marcus approached. The boy's gaze flickered with both pain and recognition. He reached out, weak fingers trembling slightly as they wrapped around his father's hand. "Don't let them win, Dad," Aaron whispered, his voice hoarse but steady. Marcus sat beside him, lowering himself slowly, as if the weight of that request had pushed him down. He didn't speak at first. He just nodded, brushing a hand gently across Aaron's forehead, feeling the warmth there and the promise buried beneath the pain. That simple sentence, spoken in a cracked whisper, lodged itself in Marcus's heart like a command, clearer than any order he had ever received in uniform. That evening, after ensuring Aaron had fallen back asleep, Marcus stepped outside the infirmary and pulled out a secure military-grade communicator from his coat. He stared at the encrypted screen for a moment, then began typing a message. One name. One person he could still trust. Captain Rowan Dane. A logistics officer who had once served with Marcus in a coastal deployment zone, Rowan had a quiet mind and a knack for discovering patterns most missed. More importantly, he had access to internal personnel files, the kind buried under layers of clearance. When Rowan arrived 3 hours later, the meeting was brief but intense. They sat in a maintenance storage room behind the infirmary, surrounded by old gear, coiled wires, and crates of unused emergency supplies. Rowan looked older, the lines on his face deeper than Marcus remembered, but his eyes still held that sharpness, calculated, always watching. "I pulled everything I could," Rowan said, handing Marcus a flash drive wrapped in black tape. "Silas Braun was never discharged, not even suspended. On paper, he's listed under a civilian liaison transfer dated 2 years ago. No disciplinary action, no incident report, nothing." Marcus clenched the drive in his hand, staring at the metal casing like it had personally betrayed him. "Which means someone protected him," Marcus muttered, his voice low and controlled, but there was an edge in it, sharp as a blade being unsheathed. Rowan nodded. "Someone high enough to bury that kind of stain." "This wasn't just an emotional outburst on a plane, Marcus. Silas didn't pick that flight by accident. He was placed there." Marcus leaned back in the chair, his jaw tightening. The idea that this attack had been planned, coordinated even, sent chills down his spine. That a man like Silas could not only avoid consequences but be actively positioned to strike. That wasn't negligence. That was a message. "Who else knows about this?" Marcus asked. "No one that I trust," Rowan replied quickly. "But I did find a few transfers attached to Silas's name. Supply reroutes, chain of command notes. Someone kept approving his station changes without flagging his record. They were hiding him in plain sight." The room felt colder now. Marcus rose, beginning to pace, each step echoing like a warning shot across concrete. His instincts, honed over decades of service, screamed that this was only the surface. There was something deeper beneath it, something more organized, more dangerous. "I need you to keep digging," Marcus said firmly, "and I need access to the full passenger manifest from that flight. I want to know if anyone else on that plane didn't belong." Rowan frowned. "You think there were more?" "I think Silas was too confident," Marcus replied. "He acted like someone with insurance. Like even if he failed, it wouldn't matter." He moved to the small window and looked out across the base, the clouds above streaked with gray. His reflection stared back at him, tired, bloodied, but focused. Back inside the infirmary later that night, Marcus returned to Aaron's bedside. The boy stirred, sensing his father's presence even before his eyes opened. Marcus sat down slowly, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out the emergency hammer, now wiped clean, the red gone from its surface, but the memory of its weight unchanged. He turned it in his hands like a relic of war. It wasn't just revenge, Marcus whispered to himself. It was an order. A mission. And someone signed off on it. Aaron blinked up at him, eyes still soft with sleep. "You found something?" Marcus nodded. "Enough to know this isn't over." He stood once more, setting the hammer on the small table beside the bed. For a long time, he stared at it. The same tool that had nearly destroyed his son, now a symbol of the truth he was determined to uncover. And as the room darkened around them, the storm inside Marcus only grew sharper. Whoever orchestrated this had underestimated the man they tried to break. That was their mistake. Because Marcus Valen would not rest. Not now. Not while his son still bore the scars. Not while truth still lay hidden beneath layers of rank and shadow. The weapon had changed hands, but the battle for truth had only sharpened. Expanded Part 9. Marcus stepped into the stark chamber without hesitation, the heavy doors sealing behind him with a mechanical hiss. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their pale glow casting long shadows against the metallic walls. At the far end of the room sat a semicircle of high-ranking officers, all in pristine uniforms, their expressions carved from stone. The air was cold, refrigerated, calculated, and it told Marcus everything he needed to know. This was not a debriefing. This was a tribunal in disguise. General Alric Stren, a name Marcus had only seen in interdepartmental memos, leaned forward. His fingers were steepled beneath his chin, and a thin smile played at his lips. "Colonel Valen," he said, voice low and deliberate. "We appreciate your cooperation. Let's keep this brief." Marcus nodded slowly, though he remained standing. He had learned long ago that silence often revealed more than speech. He watched the generals exchange glances before Stren continued. "There are discrepancies," Stren said. "Multiple witnesses recall you escalating the situation aboard the aircraft. Words were exchanged. Tensions rose. Then you struck the attendant, hard enough to break bone." Marcus didn't flinch. "That man assaulted my son with an emergency hammer," he said. "He declared his intent in front of everyone." "I acted to neutralize a threat." Stren leaned back, feigning contemplation. "That's one interpretation." But there are others, some suggesting you acted out of personal anger, that perhaps old military tensions clouded your judgment. Marcus narrowed his eyes. The air in the room thickened. He could feel it, the quiet weaving of a narrative, already in motion long before he stepped through the door. These were not questions. They were rehearsed lines in a play he hadn't been invited to audition for. "This isn't about that flight, is it?" Marcus asked, voice calm but firm. "It's about me." About what I've refused to let slide over the years, silence followed. The tension in the room rippled like a taut cable about to snap. One of the younger officers, Lieutenant General Frakes, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, eyes darting downward. Stren's smile returned, sharper this time. "You've built quite a name for yourself, Colonel. Commendations, media praise, field leadership. But not everyone thrives under bright lights. Some of us prefer shadows. You've stepped on toes. Important ones." There it was. The veil dropped, and the warning beneath the words rang clear. This wasn't about justice. This was politics wearing military dress blues. Marcus's pulse quickened, but he kept his breathing steady. "You're saying I made enemies," he said, "that standing up for what's right painted a target on my back." Stren gave a small nod, unbothered. "We all serve in our own way, Colonel. Some fight wars. Others maintain order." Marcus's thoughts raced. He recalled every mission where he had reported misappropriated supplies, every whistle he had blown on inflated contracts, every superior he had quietly refused to cover for. None of it had seemed connected before. Now the pieces fell into place. Silas was a weapon, but not a rogue one. He had been aimed. Silas Braun was not acting alone, Marcus said quietly, more to himself than to the room. He was used. "Just like you're trying to use this hearing." A few murmurs stirred among the officers, but Stren waved them down. "Let's not get carried away with conspiracy theories." "I'm not theorizing," Marcus said, stepping forward now. His voice remained low, controlled, but every syllable rang with fire. "I'm watching it happen." The silence that followed was deafening. No one interrupted him, not because they agreed, but because they weren't prepared for resistance. Stren rose from his seat, tugging his jacket into place. "This session is adjourned. Colonel Velan, you're dismissed, pending review." Marcus remained still for a beat, staring at the man. Then he turned and walked out without another word, his boots echoing loudly with each step. As the chamber doors closed behind him, the muffled sounds of whispered conversations chased him down the hallway. He walked with purpose, past rows of clerks and soldiers who stood at attention as he passed. Some met his gaze with quiet admiration. Others looked away, their loyalty uncertain. But Marcus didn't need their validation. As he stepped out into the crisp daylight, a sudden gust of wind pulled at the edge of his uniform. He looked down at the emergency hammer still wrapped in cloth inside his satchel. It hadn't left his side since that night. Not because of fear, because it meant something now. The weapon once used to break his son's innocence had become a symbol, not of revenge, but of resilience. And as he crossed the base courtyard, eyes following him from every direction, Marcus realized the truth in full clarity. This wasn't just about Aaron. It wasn't even about Silas anymore. It was about what Marcus represented, a challenge to those who hid behind power and silence. He adjusted his grip on the satchel and walked forward, unwavering. The war no longer hid in shadows. It had stepped into the open, and Marcus would meet it head-on. Night cloaked the base in stillness as Colonel Marcus Velan slipped silently into the dimly lit infirmary, his boots scuffing against the sterile floor. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting a cool, artificial glow over the rows of curtained beds. Aaron lay in the far corner, his face pale but peaceful, the bandage around his head glowing softly beneath the fluorescent lights. Marcus paused at the doorway for a moment, taking in the sight of his son resting after days of pain and fear. He hadn't allowed himself to breathe until now. Aaron stirred at the sound of his father's approach. His eyes fluttered open, glazed with fatigue but warming instantly at the sight of Marcus. A weak smile formed on his lips. "You didn't let him win," he said, his voice a breath above a whisper, raspy but resolute. Marcus knelt beside the bed, gripping Aaron's hand firmly, anchoring himself in that small, fragile connection. The pain, the politics, the threats, none of it mattered in that moment. Only his son did. He didn't respond aloud, but the promise in his eyes was unmistakable. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Hours passed. Nurses checked in and out, shadows drifted across the floor, and the hum of military life continued beyond the quiet room. It was nearing midnight when the door creaked open once more, and a figure in a field jacket stepped inside. Captain Rowan Dane moved with practiced caution, glancing over his shoulder before closing the door behind him. He held a thin black folder under his arm, its surface worn from handling. "They don't know I made copies," Rowan said without preamble, voice low as he crossed the room. Marcus stood, his face hardening at the sight of the folder. He took it without a word, motioning Rowan toward the far side of the room, behind a privacy curtain. The moment the flap closed behind them, Marcus opened the file. Inside were photocopies of internal memos, deployment records, and redacted communiques, none of which were meant to be seen by officers of their rank. Marcus flipped through page after page, his brow furrowing as he pieced together the unspoken truth. Silas wasn't acting alone, Rowan said, his arms crossed tightly. He was part of a task unit. It's called Red Spire. Unofficial, off the books, built to isolate, discredit, or eliminate officers who pushed back against certain contracts or policies. Marcus's hand paused over one page. A weapons contract, classified, high level, marked with his signature of disapproval from 3 months earlier. This is what started it?" he asked, the words burning like dry paper in his throat. Rowan nodded. "You blocked their supply line. You made enemies. Silas was activated weeks later. He never left the service, Marcus. His dismissal was staged. The pieces clicked together with alarming speed. The hostility, the attack, the cover-up, the nod between Silas and the federal officer on the tarmac. It wasn't coincidence, it was coordinated." Marcus closed the folder slowly. He stared at the fabric of the curtain in front of him, trying to steady his breathing. Anger threatened to boil over, but he tamped it down beneath years of discipline. His son had been nearly killed, and now he realized that wasn't collateral damage, it was the message. "They wanted to break me," Marcus said, his voice colder than Rowan had ever heard it. "Bleed me from the inside, through my boy." Rowan's face darkened. "And if they're bold enough to use children to send messages, they won't stop at that." Silence hung thick between them. Then Marcus turned back toward Aaron's bed. The boy was awake again, watching them both quietly. His eyes were sharper now, aware. He had always been a smart kid, more observant than people gave him credit for. "What did they want from you?" Aaron asked, his voice slightly stronger than before. Marcus knelt again, his expression softening. He glanced at Rowan, then back at his son. "They wanted to make an example of me. For saying no when I was supposed to say yes. For standing when they expected me to kneel." Aaron studied his father's face. Despite the bruises under Marcus's eyes, despite the bandage on his arm, the boy didn't see weakness. He saw fire. "You're not going to let them win now, either," Aaron said, more a statement than a question. "No," Marcus replied firmly, "but I can't fight them head-on." "Not yet. This isn't about muscle. It's about patience, precision. Soldiers don't charge blind." Aaron nodded slowly. "So, what do we do?" "We plan," Marcus said. "We expose them piece by piece, use their arrogance against them, gather evidence, build allies, and when the time comes—" He trailed off, glancing again at the hammer sitting on the nearby table, polished now, clean, but heavy with meaning. "We strike, with the truth, with honor." Rowan stepped forward, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You won't be alone in this." For the first time in days, Marcus allowed a flicker of hope to settle into his chest. It was small, but steady. He turned back to Aaron, gently adjusting the blanket over his chest. "This fight is no longer just ours. It's for every man who wears this uniform with honor." Aaron's eyes shone, not with fear, but pride. "Then don't stop until it's done, Dad." Rain tapped lightly against the corrugated roof of the deserted hangar as Marcus stepped inside, his boots echoing against the concrete floor. The space was vast, hollow, and dimly lit by a single overhead light that flickered every few seconds. He didn't need to call out. Captain Rowan Dane was already there, waiting in the shadows near a rusting supply crate, clutching a folder wrapped in a black cloth. Marcus approached with deliberate steps, his face still marked by tension and exhaustion, his left hand loosely holding the hammer, not as a threat, but as a reminder. Rowan's expression was grave. "He's not where they said he'd be," Rowan said quietly, stepping forward. "Silas never made it to the holding unit." Marcus's jaw tightened. Where is he? Rowan handed over the folder. Private medical center, off books, one of the sites used for field recovery and deep ops. It's the same one we used during those black missions in Iraq Delta, remember? Marcus opened the folder with steady hands. Inside were copies of logs, transport signatures, and a treatment record for a broken wrist. His breath grew shallow. The facility was known to cover for intelligence assets, operatives too valuable to be processed through normal channels. They didn't punish him, Marcus muttered, voice low and bitter. They patched him up. Rowan nodded grimly. And that's not the worst of it. He hesitated, then pulled a second sheet from his coat pocket. There's chatter, quiet but growing, that Silas is preparing a formal statement. One that claims you were erratic, dangerous, even unstable. Marcus stared at the paper in his friend's hand, the edges shaking slightly from restrained fury. They're setting the stage, he said, trying to flip the narrative before the truth takes root. Rowan looked around the hangar as if making sure they were still alone. They'll use Aaron. Say your judgment was clouded by emotion, that your attack on Silas was excessive. They'll spin it. Marcus gripped the hammer tighter, the image of Aaron's blood running down his temple flashing vividly in his mind. His knuckles whitened, but he exhaled slowly, grounding himself. No, he said, voice firm. I won't give them what they want. They want rage in the open. They want me to be the man they're painting, but I'll make them expose themselves instead. Rowan raised an eyebrow. How? We use what they don't expect, Marcus replied, eyes narrowing. Truth, evidence, and their arrogance. He began pacing slowly, thinking aloud as he pieced together a plan. If Silas is their mouthpiece, they'll parade him in public. Try to make him a martyr. I want him visible. I want them overconfident. While they build their stage, we build the trap underneath it. Rowan crossed his arms. You'll need more than just my word and this file. I know, Marcus nodded. We start with the passengers. Testimonies. Any footage they might have recorded during the attack. Someone must have captured it. Fear paralyzed them then, but maybe now they'll want to be part of something that brings justice. Rowan gave a grim smile. You're still fighting like a soldier. Marcus shook his head. No. Soldiers fight in silence. This needs light. We gather officers who still value integrity quietly. We use their own protocols against them. If they want hearings, we'll be ready. He stopped pacing and looked up, the resolve in his eyes hard as steel. But it won't be enough to just prove what Silas did. We have to show the web he's part of. Red Spire isn't just rumor anymore. I want every name, every operation they buried, every man they silenced. Rowan hesitated. You realize what that means? The higher you climb, the more dangerous it gets. These aren't officers playing politics. They're architects of war. I know, Marcus replied, but they made a mistake. They came for my son thinking I'd break. Instead, they gave me purpose. Rowan stepped closer, his voice dropping. If this fails, if they twist this too far— They won't, Marcus interrupted, voice sharp but calm, because this time, we're writing the story. I won't let them twist honor into weakness. The light overhead buzzed again, casting momentary shadows across their faces. What if Silas vanishes again? Rowan asked. He won't, Marcus said. He's too valuable to them right now. They'll keep him close, thinking they can control him. But people like Silas, they crack under truth. I just need him to speak first. He turned toward the exit, the hammer now tucked under his arm like a relic from a battlefield. Rowan watched him, understanding the weight of what had just begun. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the ground remained soaked, just like the air around them. Heavy, charged, waiting. Marcus paused at the threshold, looking back over his shoulder. This war won't be fought with weapons, he said. It'll be fought in minds, in memories, in what people choose to believe. And I intend to show them what honor really looks like. Rowan gave a single, solemn nod. Then let's bring it into the light. Marcus stepped out into the night, his silhouette vanishing into mist and shadow, the burden of justice tightening in his chest, but his purpose now clearer than ever, sharpening with every step. The battlefield was shifting from steel and fire to words and revelation. The room fell silent as Silas entered, his left wrist bound tightly in a dark brace that contrasted against the crisp white of his shirt. The air inside the tribunal chamber was heavy, a mixture of polished wood, muted whispers, and the faint metallic scent of tension. Rows of officers, advisors, and clerks filled the gallery, their uniforms a sea of gray and blue. Silas walked with a limp he didn't need, his eyes darting between sympathetic faces, his lips forming a practiced tremble. When he sat, he raised his head slowly, looking directly at the panel of senior officials as though he were the injured party dragged into a stage not of his own making. "I served with loyalty," Silas began, his voice soft but edged with bitterness. He adjusted the brace deliberately, letting the leather creak as if underscoring his pain. "For years, I endured humiliation under Colonel Velan's command. The man broke me. I lost my career, my name, my dignity. That flight," he paused, his eyes glistening as he glanced toward the back of the room, "was the breaking point." I snapped. Murmurs rose from the audience. A few members of the panel nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a tragic confession. Silas lowered his gaze, shoulders slumped, playing his role of a man crushed under authority. The room felt tilted in his favor. From the far side of the chamber, Marcus Velan stood without waiting for permission. His presence cut through the murmurs like a drawn blade. He wore his uniform immaculate despite the faint scar on his forearm, his posture straight, his face calm but unreadable. In his hands he carried the cracked emergency hammer, wrapped in clear evidence plastic but unmistakable. He didn't raise it. He simply held it at his side as he stepped forward to the lectern, boots echoing on the marble floor. The room stilled. Even the panel leaned back slightly, sensing the shift. "Everything you just heard," Marcus said, his voice steady, "is a performance." He placed the hammer gently on the table before him, letting the faint thud echo through the chamber. "This is the truth." He tapped the plastic with one finger, then looked directly at Silas. "This tool, which you used on my son, is not a symbol of your suffering. It is evidence." His eyes swept across the room, meeting each panel member in turn. "And I will prove it." A screen flickered to life behind him. Video footage rolled, grainy but clear. Silas standing in the aircraft aisle, hammer raised, the blow striking Aaron. Gasps erupted from the gallery. An aide scrambled to pause it, but Marcus continued, voice growing stronger. "This was not an accident. It was not desperation. It was planned, and it was part of something far larger than one man's grievance." He gestured to Captain Rowan Dane, who stepped forward from the shadows of the gallery, a folder clutched to his chest. Rowan's hands trembled slightly as he spoke, but his eyes were firm. "These are classified files, members of the panel. Documents linking Silas Braun to an unsanctioned unit operating under the name Red Spire." He handed the files to the tribunal clerk. "They show recruitment patterns, funding, and orders to target Colonel Velan." He paused, his voice tightening. "Orders that go far beyond disciplinary matters." The room shifted like a tide. Officers whispered, heads bowed to read the pages as they were passed along. A general on the panel paled, his pen clattering to the desk. Another man's jaw tightened as though preparing a defense. Marcus watched them, silent now, letting the evidence work. In the back row, Aaron sat upright despite his bandaged head, his hands clenched on his knees. He had insisted on attending, and now his eyes followed his father with pride and worry mingled. Silas's mask cracked, his lips pressed into a thin line, eyes darting from the files to Marcus and back again. Sweat formed at his temple, darkening the fabric near his collar. "Those files are lies," he said suddenly, voice sharper, higher, forged, fabricated by a man desperate to salvage his image. But the tremor in his tone betrayed him. The panelists no longer nodded. They stared, some with open suspicion, others with dawning fear of what these revelations might mean for their own careers. Marcus leaned forward, voice low but cutting through the noise. "You were never the mastermind, Silas. You were their weapon, and now you are the key to exposing them." His words carried no triumph, only fact. The hammer on the table gleamed under the overhead lights, a reminder of blood and betrayal. "You chose to strike my son. That choice was yours. But everything else, every manipulation, every order, will come to light here, not in shadows." A silence settled, heavier than before. The panel fractured. One member demanded that the files be authenticated immediately. Another muttered about internal inquiries. Rowan stood tall, his face pale but resolute, while Marcus remained still, his hands resting lightly on the table. He knew this was only the first crack in a wall that had stood for years, but it was a crack nonetheless. In the gallery, Aaron's lips curved into the faintest smile, a fragile but genuine expression. He had seen his father fight battles before, but never like this, with words instead of weapons, with evidence instead of force. The boy straightened his back despite the ache in his head, pride warming his gaze. Marcus caught that look and, for the first time since the flight, felt a flicker of hope stronger than anger. Silas, realizing the shift, sagged in his chair. The brace on his wrist seemed heavier now, less a badge of injury and more a shackle of guilt. His eyes met Marcus's, and for an instant, something like fear flickered there. Fear not of punishment, but of irrelevance, of being discarded by the very network that had used him. The tribunal chamber felt like a battlefield where no one could retreat. Papers rustled like distant gunfire. The hammer lay between them all, not as a threat, but as a testament. Marcus's voice cut through the tension one final time, calm and unyielding. This ends with the truth. Gasps rippled across the chamber as the truth unfolded. Rowan submitted the Red Spire files, exposing the Shadow Unit's existence. Panic spread among the generals as names they thought buried were spoken aloud. Silas's face drained of color as he realized he was no longer a pawn. He was the key witness tying corruption to the surface. The panel fractured, some demanded justice, others scrambled to protect themselves. Aaron, watching from the back with a bandaged head, smiled faintly as his father dismantled the conspiracy with words sharper than any blade. The hammer had struck again, not in violence, but in truth. The gavel struck with a sharp crack that echoed through the chamber, silencing every whisper, every breath. The room, packed with military officials, officers, investigators, and a scattering of civilians, hung in tense stillness. The presiding officer leaned forward, voice steady but resonant with finality. The tribunal finds the accused, Silas Braun, guilty of aggravated assault, attempted endangerment of a minor, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The Red Spire unit is hereby declared an illegal entity, and all operations tied to it will be dismantled under immediate oversight. The words rippled across the room like a shockwave. Whispers burst from the corners, not of doubt, but disbelief. Disbelief that truth had actually won. That the system, so often shrouded in politics and silence, had been cracked open. Colonel Marcus Valen did not blink. He stood at full attention in his dress uniform, its collar stiff against his bruised neck, the bloodstains of a week ago long scrubbed but never forgotten. He kept his eyes locked forward, jaw set, refusing to show relief. Not yet. Not until it was over. Silas sat across from him, slouched and pale, a brace clamped tight around his shattered wrist. His once smug expression had dissolved into hollow fatigue. The confession had come late, under pressure, and with the knowledge that he had been abandoned by those who once backed him. His eyes darted to Marcus but quickly fell away, as if unable to bear the weight of what he'd done. Beside the tribunal bench, high-ranking officers, some who had once doubted Marcus, others who had openly accused him, now sat in stunned silence. The Red Spire files had cut deeper than anyone expected. Names had been named, operations exposed, budgets traced, and lies unraveled. As the court recessed, Marcus turned slowly and caught the gaze of his son. Aaron stood near the back of the chamber, wrapped in a gray military-issue blanket despite the warmth. His head was still bandaged, the swelling nearly gone now, but the scar above his eyebrow told a story no one could erase. He gave his father a quiet nod, not of victory, but of respect. Later that evening, the infirmary hallway was washed in amber light as the sun dipped below the horizon. The hospital wing had quieted, the sounds of footsteps and intercoms replaced by a steady hum of distant generators and the soft beep of vitals in nearby rooms. Aaron sat up in bed, legs tucked under the blanket, his face drawn but alert. Marcus entered with a slow, measured stride, the old emergency hammer tucked under his arm. Clean now, polished. The handle reinforced with steel and a small plaque near the base, a date, nothing more. "I heard," Aaron said, his voice hoarse but steady. "They dropped everything," Marcus replied, pulling a chair beside the bed. "The charges. The smear. The conspiracy's out." Aaron looked down at his hands, then at the hammer in his father's lap. His fingers twitched slightly, then reached out. Marcus handed it over without a word. For a moment, Aaron simply stared at the object. His reflection warped across the metal. "He used this on me," he murmured. "But now, it's proof of everything, isn't it?" Marcus nodded. "It is. And more than that, it's proof that we survived." Aaron turned the tool in his hands and then placed it gently back in his father's palm. "You turned their weapon into ours." Marcus didn't reply at first. He stared at the hammer as if seeing it for the first time all over again. A tool meant to save lives, misused for revenge, now reclaimed. They stepped outside a few minutes later into the cool dusk. The infirmary courtyard was quiet, its hedges trimmed, the flag at half-mast for unrelated fallen. There were no reporters, no soldiers snapping salutes, just the two of them. Aaron walked a little slower than before, but the strength in his steps was growing. Marcus stayed beside him, matching his pace. Neither spoke as they moved along the gravel path. The shadows stretched long across the ground, but a golden glow still kissed the horizon. Marcus felt the hammer's weight at his side, not a burden, but a reminder of pain, of justice, of the oath he had sworn, not only to a country, but to a boy who called him father. They paused near the edge of the yard, where a chain-link fence divided the military wing from the open fields beyond. Aaron turned toward him. "What happens next?" Marcus looked into the distance where the sun dipped low and shadows waited. He knew there would be more battles, different ones, some in courtrooms, some in silence. But for the first time in weeks, he wasn't afraid of them. He leaned closer, voice low, spoken only for his son to hear. "We are unbreakable." He tried to break a boy with steel, but minutes later, his own wrist snapped under it. If you stand for dignity, protection, and accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of revenge, unchecked anger, and the consequences of turning violence against others. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire accountability, justice, and empathy in the face of conflict.